There is a gap on a shelf near you right now, not a gap caused by a late delivery or a stockroom mix-up. A gap that is the result of something far larger, far more complicated, and far more permanent than most of us have been told. And it started with something you probably bought last week without a second thought. Cast your mind back to your grandmother's kitchen. Eggs were the one thing that was always there, on the worktop, in a bowl, never rationed, never fussed over. For generations, the British egg was the most reliable item in the house, cheaper than almost anything, available everywhere. The foundation of a good meal, whether you had tuppence or £10 to your name. In April 2026, that certainty is crumbling. The price of a dozen free-range eggs in Britain has risen by over 40% compared to 3 years ago. The main reason is not greed from supermarkets, and it is not a lazy excuse from suppliers. It is avian influenza, the worst outbreak in recorded British history, which led to the culling of over 26 million birds across England, Scotland and Wales between 2021 and 2024. Laying flocks have never fully recovered to pre-outbreak levels, and the cost of biosecurity measures, feed and heating for poultry sheds, has continued to climb since. Many small family farms that once supplied local retailers have quietly shut their gates for the last time, unable to absorb the losses. What made things worse is that the recovery in flock numbers coincided almost exactly with a sharp rise in energy costs following the disruption of global fuel supplies from the Gulf region. Heating a commercial poultry shed through a British spring is not cheap. When energy bills doubled, several mid-sized producers simply walked away. The result is that eggs, once the working-class kitchen's greatest friend, are now rationed in some stores and double the price in others. If you feel like something fundamental has shifted, you're not imagining it. Something has. And this is far from the only item that should concern you. Walk through any supermarket dairy aisle today and you will notice something that would have seemed inconceivable 10 years ago. The mid-priced cheddars, the own-brand hard cheeses, the familiar blocks that were always piled high are thinning out. Some mornings, fresh milk runs low before the lunchtime rush. The British dairy industry has been struggling for years, but the pressures of 2025 and into 2026 have pushed many producers past their breaking point. The cost of cattle feed, which relies heavily on grain and protein supplements affected by global supply disruptions, has risen substantially. Diesel for farm vehicles and milk tankers has remained elevated. And the price that dairy farmers receive from processors has, in many cases, failed to keep pace with what it now costs to produce a litre of milk. The result is an accelerating exit from the industry. According to Dairy UK, the number of milk-producing farms in the United Kingdom has fallen from around 35,000 in the 1990s to fewer than 7,000 today. That decline, slow but steady for decades, has sharpened. The farms remaining are often operating on margins so thin that a single bad quarter can finish them. For most of us who remember when the milkman came every morning, when milk was not something you ever gave a second thought, the idea of a genuine domestic milk shortage feels alien. But it is no longer a distant possibility. It is already a reality for some communities where smaller retailers cannot guarantee daily restocking. If things do not stabilize quickly, the ripple effects through yogurt, cream, butter, and cheese will be hard to ignore. If you like to start the morning with a glass of orange juice, you may already have noticed that your usual carton is more expensive than it was. Much more expensive in some cases. The reason begins thousands of miles away in Florida. which was for most of the 20th century the engine of the global citrus industry and a cornerstone of British breakfast tables. In recent decades, Florida's orange groves have been devastated by a bacterial disease known as citrus greening, spread by a tiny insect called the Asian citrus psyllid. The disease has no cure. Once a tree is infected, it declines until it can no longer produce viable fruit. The United States Department of Agriculture has reported that Florida's orange production has fallen to its lowest levels in roughly 90 years, a staggering collapse in one of the world's most important agricultural regions. That alone would be enough to push prices up, but the disruption to shipping routes from the Gulf region has made importing from alternative growing areas in North Africa and Southern Europe significantly more expensive. Freight costs have risen sharply. Smaller importers have been squeezed out of the market entirely, reducing competition and pushing retail prices higher still. For pensioners who have drunk a small glass of orange juice every morning since the 1970s, this is not merely a financial inconvenience. It is the quiet disappearance of something that felt like a permanent fixture of daily life. And once these supply chains shrink, rebuilding them takes years, not months. Tomatoes have been a constant on British dining tables since at least the post-war era, steadily becoming one of the most reliably purchased items in the weekly shop. Whether sliced with a piece of toast, chopped into a stew, or simply eaten with a bit of cheese, the tomato feels as British as anything, despite its Mediterranean origins, which is precisely why its disappearance from shelves feels so alarming. The domestic growing industry, centred largely in the glasshouses of the Lee Valley in Hertfordshire and growers across West Yorkshire, has been under enormous strain. Growing tomatoes indoors in Britain requires substantial and continuous energy input to maintain warmth. When gas prices surged following disruptions to European supply, many growers faced a choice between heating their glasshouses at a loss or simply not planting. The Lee Valley Growers Association has warned publicly that dozens of operations have scaled back or ceased production entirely. With domestic supply declining, Britain became more dependent on imports, primarily from Spain and Morocco. But in the winter and spring running into 2026, both countries were hit by severe and unusual weather. Frost damage, flooding, and temperature swings at the wrong moments in the growing cycle wiped out a significant proportion of yields. Major retailers, including Tesco and Asda, brought back purchasing limits on tomatoes and certain salad vegetables, a measure not seen in Britain outside of wartime and the pandemic era. For lower-income households who have always relied on tomatoes as one of the cheapest and most versatile items in the kitchen, the price rises have been genuinely painful. A simple salad, a staple of affordable, healthy eating, has become something of a luxury. Now we come to the item that, perhaps more than any other, carries the emotional weight of what is happening to Britain's food supply: bread. There is something almost symbolic about the loaf. Long before avocados and smoothies and protein shakes, bread was the measure of a household's well-being. Anyone who grew up in Britain in the decades after the war knows what it meant to have a fresh loaf on the table. It was ordinary, but it was everything. In April 2026, that ordinary reassurance is under real threat. The agricultural chain behind a British loaf is longer and more fragile than most people realize. It begins with fertilizer, specifically nitrogen-based compounds, including urea, much of which is produced using ammonia derived from natural gas. A significant portion of that gas originates in or passes through the Gulf region. When supply lines tighten and energy costs rise, fertilizer prices follow. Global fertilizer prices rose sharply through 2022 and 2023, and, while they eased somewhat, climbed again through 2025. Higher fertilizer costs mean higher costs for wheat farmers, which feed through directly into flour prices and then into the price on the shelf. The just-in-time distribution model that Britain's food supply relies upon means there is very little buffer. Supermarkets do not hold large reserves. They depend on weekly, and sometimes daily, replenishment. When the diesel that powers the lorries becomes more expensive, the supply chain absorbs it briefly and then passes it on to the customer. When bread prices jumped at major retailers in recent years, it was the fastest annual increase in decades. The pressure has not eased. For families on fixed incomes, including the many pensioners relying on the state pension, a meaningful rise in the price of a basic loaf is not an abstract statistic. It is a decision each week about what they can afford and what they have to go without. Bread is not yet gone from the shelves, but it is no longer cheap, and it is no longer guaranteed. Perhaps less essential in the traditional British diet than bread or eggs, the bell pepper has nonetheless become a firmly established part of the weekly shop for millions of households. It appears in stir-fries, pasta dishes, salads, and roasted vegetable trays up and down the country, and in 2026 it is disappearing. Spain is the dominant supplier of bell peppers to the British market, particularly through the greenhouses of Almeria in southern Spain, which produces a vast proportion of Europe's fresh vegetables. In recent growing seasons, Almeria's output has been disrupted by extreme weather events, including unseasonal heavy rain, localized flooding, and temperature swings that damage crops before harvest. Reports from Spanish agricultural associations in early 2026 indicated that certain growing regions experienced crop losses significantly above the seasonal average, with some pepper varieties seeing yields well below expectations. The logistics of getting a fragile, perishable item from southern Spain to a supermarket shelf in Manchester or Edinburgh have also become more expensive. Fuel costs for refrigerated lorries have risen. Driver shortages, partly a legacy of post-Brexit changes to freedom of movement, have not fully resolved. Each of these pressures individually would be manageable. Together, they are making bell peppers an increasingly expensive item. You may not think of a pepper as a luxury. By the end of 2026, that perception may be forced to change. A bottle of olive oil sitting on the kitchen counter has become one of the most recognizable features of the modern British kitchen. Since the 1980s, when Mediterranean food genuinely entered mainstream British cooking, olive oil moved from specialist delicatessen item to supermarket staple. Today, Britain imports the vast majority of its olive oil from Spain, Italy, and Greece. But the olive harvest across the Mediterranean has been under extraordinary strain for several consecutive seasons. Spain, the world's largest producer of olive oil, experienced a near-catastrophic harvest season in 2022 to 2023, when extreme drought and high temperatures slashed yields to roughly half of normal levels. Global olive oil prices subsequently reached record highs, though the following season offered some recovery in production. So retail prices in Britain remained significantly elevated, and continued weather volatility, combined with higher transportation costs, has kept them there. A standard litre bottle of extra virgin olive oil that cost around £4 in 2020 now routinely sells for between £7 and £9 in British supermarkets. For many households, olive oil has quietly shifted from everyday cooking to something used more sparingly, reserved for occasions when it makes a real difference rather than poured without thought. Cheaper alternatives have filled the gap, but the shift represents something real: the narrowing of everyday food choices that people had genuinely come to rely upon. The drought conditions driving these harvests are long-term in nature. There is no quick agricultural fix, and with the added pressure of higher shipping costs, prices are unlikely to fall meaningfully in the near future. Finally, something that does not go on your plate, but without which the kitchen quickly becomes unmanageable: washing up liquid, along with shampoo, hand soap, and other bottled household products, is facing a crisis that has nothing to do with what is inside the bottle. The problem is the bottle itself. The plastic used to manufacture most household product containers is polyethylene, a material whose raw ingredients are largely derived from petrochemical refining. A substantial portion of the world's supply of these precursor chemicals originates in refineries and processing facilities in the Gulf region. When energy supply chains from that area are disrupted, the knock-on effect reaches British supermarket shelves in the form of packaging shortages and sharply higher manufacturing costs for everyday household brands. This has been compounded by the United Kingdom's plastic packaging tax, which was introduced in April 2022 and has since increased, applying a levy on plastic packaging that does not meet a minimum threshold of recycled content. The tax, combined with the rise in raw material costs, has created significant pressure on brands relying on standard plastic packaging. Some manufacturers have responded by quietly reducing bottle sizes while holding prices. Others have temporarily suspended certain product lines. Several retailers have already noted periods of limited availability on specific household cleaning items. This may not seem as dramatic as empty bread shelves or rocketing egg prices. But it speaks to the same underlying truth. The systems that deliver even the most ordinary items to your doorstep are more fragile and more interconnected than most of us were ever led to believe. 10 years ago, if you had told someone queuing at their local high street that eggs, milk, tomatoes, bread, orange juice, peppers, olive oil, and a bottle of washing-up liquid might all be harder to come by and significantly more expensive by 2026, they would have found it very hard to believe. That is not a criticism. The system worked quietly and invisibly for so long that it became invisible itself. We stopped seeing it because we never had to think about it. What April 2026 is asking of all of us is that we start seeing it again. The encouraging signs, and they do exist, are that communities which recognize these vulnerabilities early have more options. Allotments across Britain have seen a genuine resurgence of interest. Local farmers' markets, once dismissed as expensive extras, are attracting new customers who simply want more reliable access to food grown closer to home. These are not solutions for everyone, but they are signals worth paying attention to. The weekly shop, that great British ritual, is changing. Rather than wait to be told what to make of it, it is worth asking yourself, what would you do differently if you knew the shelves were genuinely less reliable than you had always assumed?